Hi, our project for ISOM 310 is No Boots on the Ground, The Soldierless War by Angela DeMeo, Daniel Norton, and Walida Mansar. So, our theory is that there's no need anymore for thousands of people to sacrifice their lives for the sake of war. Technology has given the military options to replace the precious lives of soldiers, and they can still accomplish their missions. The advancement of drone technology is a major step in the strive to not have any boots on the ground. Combat history. The bow and arrow is the first weapon known. The earliest records of it date back to 6,000 years ago. The Chinese developed gunpowder. The first use of it was in fire arrows against the Mongol hordes in what may be the earliest known use of rockets in battle. Lastly, atomic bomb was detonated in 1945 in New Mexico. Now the military has drones to fight in place of people. World War One. The rifle was the main weapon that was used. It could fire 15 rounds per minute and has a range of 1,400 meters. Machine guns were also available, but they had to be placed on a flat surface and took 4 to 6 soldiers to operate. Plus, the plus size that it had the power of 100 rifles. Tanks were also used for protection. Planes were first used in World War One. They were used to deliver bombs and spy on the enemy. Torpedoes were used by the German army, used on their submarines to blow up ships that were carrying supplies from America to Britain. In World War II, there was much improvement on rifles, tanks, planes, and the introduction of rockets by the military of the Germans. We've come to conclude that the previous tactics of battle are unnecessary and harmful. Trench warfare had many diseases and infections caused by rats and unsanitary conditions. They accounted for a third of all the injuries, including trench foot and trench fever. Modern advancements in tactics were guerrilla warfare, which caused soldiers to be less time in trenches, they had less infections, and there were less casualties. It was more efficient because armies could spy and attack enemies without knowledge or face-to-face combat. Modern technological developments. Robot mules. These mules will carry gear and ammo for soldiers. It is able to sustain a lot of weight and is able to move freely around tough terrain. The meshworm. It's a small device that can detect temperatures in a confined space and record data. A flybot is a device that can be sent into a place too dangerous for soldiers and can seek out and detect chemical bombs. Drones are the last and the main point of our project and will be discussed further.
Now we're going to talk about the different types of drones. There are a lot of different types of drones that different nations and militaries use, but these happen to be the 5 most popular of them. There's the surveillance drone, the predator drone, the tempest drone, the helicopter drone, and the Kikatis drone. And those ones work hand in hand with the tempest drones because the tempest drones are much like a balloon, and they actually discard these other Kikatis drones off, and they act much like a paper airplane flying down and recording data for them to process and go through. The helicopter drone is much like a helicopter, just unmanned, and delivers supplies and products to military that needs the supplies, and they also do drop-offs for people in hunger and stuff like that. The predator drones is much like the one you see in the corner, upright corner. They use those for military tactics like shooting missiles, blowing buildings up, etc. And then there's also the surveillance drones that fly around and basically are exactly what they say they are, surveillance, and they run around and just take down surveillance data, anything that's needed to be collected. And what are drones? So drones are essentially an unmanned aircraft. As you see here in the bottom left corner, this helicopter drone doesn't have a pilot in it. It basically runs on itself. A pilot would actually drive it, but he would actually be placed on the ground elsewhere in a safe location where he can man the helicopter, the predator drones, any of those ones, from a safe location. They use a very sophisticated technology system that processes information at a very high rate and allows them to be very accurate and precision based. Basically, what these drones do, depending on the type, they carry out airstrikes, like I said, surveillance and recon for military and government if they need it, and also, which is crazy enough, they have now drones that can now deliver packages, such as from Amazon and whatnot, and it's being in the works as of now. So what purposes do drones serve? So drones provide aerial flights without the need for a pilot on board. So essentially what this does is allow the pilot to be safely on the ground while the drone is up in the air, basically lowering the fatality rate, and essentially will be the reason why soldiers won't necessarily have to be on the ground. They also are much quicker and faster transport. They transport supplies, weapons, food, anything like that, at a much quicker, faster, and more accurate rate. And there's also less human interaction as well, so there's tends to be less human error, such as those if a pilot's up in the air and he has to make a critical decision. They're a lot more under pressure in that instance, so it's easier for them to make a decision once in a less stress environment. And then also the bad side of drones, some things that need to be looked at as well. Hacking becomes an issue. The technology is more affordable than it ever has been before, so it would take less money and resources to get a hold of this technology and use it, so hopefully it's in the right hands. Obviously security problems, national security, anything, if there's drones flying in, unflyable areas, if they're flying in airports, disrupting other aircrafts, that's a problem. And obviously legal dilemmas, whether or not they're an invasion of privacy or anything of that. Another thing to also be discussed is nuclear warfare. These drones are very capable of handling and carrying all sorts of different type of weaponry and nuclear warfare type products themselves. So now we're going to go into and dive into a little bit more in the chemical warfare aspect.
Chemical warfare. What is chemical warfare? Chemical warfare is the use of chemical substances or toxic of chemicals as weapons in war, and is distinct from nuclear and biological uses, which is referred to as NBC, nuclear, biological, and chemical weapons, or weapons of mass destruction. Nowadays, many countries have a huge amount of what is being called stockpiles, which is a pile or storage location for bulk materials just in case of a war. The US and chemical warfare. The United States has developed a nuclear power in the 1940s, and it's the only country that used nuclear weapons when Hiroshima was bombed in World War II. And it was the first country that had nuclear weapons before the Soviet Union started to make nuclear weapons. But the US still had more power because they had more of those weapons. And in 1952, the US started a preparation of a very powerful toxin called toxic resin. And in 1958, the US government and the British government traded their chemical weapons in an exchange of nuclear weapons. The Soviet Union started making nuclear weapons and weapons of mass destruction after the US, but the US was still the most powerful country because they had more weapons. The war in Afghanistan. When the Soviets were in Afghanistan, reports showed numerous numbers of chemical weapons used during the war against all types of people, whether civilians or armies. But the Soviets were very cautious not to reveal any information, and that's why very few people knew about the chemical attacks in Afghanistan until recently. The Soviets were very successful in the mid-1980s because they even developed more toxic weapons. China. China was the first Asian state to have weapons of mass destruction. They started testing their nuclear weapons in 1964, and tests were still happening until they signed the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty in 1996. Also, China declared that they had possessed chemical weapons, but they were destroyed before signing the Chemical Weapons Convention in 1993.
Thank you for listening to our presentation.